Great. So we've got about 65 participants in. I think we'll get flowing with our webinar here, coming in from Illinois, Bloomington, Southern Iowa, Quebec, New York, from the UK. Great. Bunch of people logging in. So my name is Joshua Zuckerman. I am with the Delta Institute. Today we have Kaitie Adams from the Savanna Institute, Nathan Aberg from the Liberty Prairie Foundation, Lucas Chamberlain, who's helping us on the tech side from the Delta Institute as well. Today we're going to be going over Agroforestry series, planning and designing agroforestry systems. Who we are and what we are focusing on and why agroforestry. So we're going to tell a little about ourselves, and then we're going to get really into the depth of the webinar here. Nathan's going to introduce the Liberty Prairie Foundation for us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nathan Aberg with the Liberty Prairie Foundation. We're a nonprofit based in Grays Lake, Illinois. We have a 94-acre farm. We care a lot about how nature and people work and thrive together. And one of the ways we do that is promoting different kinds of agriculture that are good for people's health and for the farmer and for the land. One of the ways we also help out with that is our Illinois Farm Link program, Northeast Illinois Farm Link, that's designed to connect landowners with farmers in Northeast Illinois and help them find each other and develop really good long-term, solid 10-year arrangements for their land.
Thank you, Nathan. The Delta Institute, we are a Chicago-based nonprofit. We like to say that we help Midwestern communities adopt sustainability solutions. Again, my name is Josh. I lead our agriculture portfolio here at the Institute. And our real thing that we're looking at these days in our resilient agriculture portfolio is scaling the transition to regenerative agriculture. So very relevant to agroforestry, but very relevant to what we're doing here today. We also have a nature-based climate solutions portfolio. We have a lot of great projects. If you'd like to learn more, please feel free to visit the Delta Institute website. And Kaitie Adams.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaitie Adams, and I'm representing the Savanna Institute today, and we're excited to be partnering with Delta Institute and Liberty Prairie Foundation through this EPA program focused on water quality and agroforestry. And the Savanna Institute is a nonprofit organization based in Illinois, Wisconsin, and kind of broadly throughout the Midwest that focuses on widespread agroforestry adoption. So we do a lot of this work by working one-on-one with folks through our TSP program. We have a research and commercialization arm. We run a demonstration farm network, including our home farm in Spring Green, Wisconsin. And we do a lot of education and outreach to let folks know what agroforestry is and how it can fold into their lives and farms.
Funny enough, if you were with us last time around, Kaitie presented on an introduction to agroforestry, the Good Agroforestry 101. It was a great presentation. It is up on our websites if you'd like to rewatch it or if you haven't seen it yet. And today, Kaitie will also be presenting, and we're going to get into Kaitie's background a little bit. She's going to introduce herself. She's also going to introduce Sven, who was going to be presenting today and unfortunately is not able to make it. Kaitie, please feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, it's me again. I am the director of demonstration farms here at the Savanna Institute, and I'm based in Illinois. And my work is pretty broadly focused on our network of farms that showcase what agroforestry can do in different places throughout the state. I also work pretty closely with Sven, who is our technical service provider, who is supposed to be presenting today. Unfortunately, he's out sick. So Sven, I hope I do this presentation justice. And Matt Wilson, who's our technical service provider in Wisconsin, is also in the chat and can help answer some questions that are more technical as well. My background is in anthropology, and then I became a veggie farmer and a farm educator and found my way to the Savanna Institute after my body was getting really tired. And I spent a lot more time looking up at trees and thinking about the ways that we can incorporate them more into our farm landscapes to save our bodies, increase our biodiversity, and then produce really tasty products for folks as well. And let's see if I can advance. Oh, there we go. And then I also want to introduce Sven, who is our agroforestry technical service provider. He's based here in Illinois and serves clients broadly throughout the state. And he works really closely with agroforestry planning and design. So I want to encourage folks to reach out to Sven. Even though I'm giving this presentation, he's really our expert on the ground doing this work here in the state.
Sorry about that. We're sharing screens and two mice at the same time looking to unmute. We are going to go over our polls today. We want to learn a little bit about who is here and what you're going to be doing here. So Lucas, if you want to go ahead and launch our first poll. Who are you? We'd like to know a little bit about who you are. If everyone wants to go ahead and answer that. All right, let's see if we could get the results from that. So we've got about 30% of our audience is farmers, 38% landowners, government agencies are in the room, university and researchers, nonprofit employees, and other. That's great. Thank you for sharing. Why are you here? We would love to know why you are here today. The next poll is going to come up on your screen. If you're curious, you'd like to advise farmers, you want to learn how to implement your own agroforestry system, or if you're just here to connect to us potentially. Of course, there's always the other box. Give you guys a couple seconds to vote. Also, anytime during the presentation today, please feel free to put your questions into chat. I will be looking at them, taking a list of them. We're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the session here today to go over questions and hopefully give you some answers. See what the results of our poll are. Just curious to help advise farmers, about 37%, how to implement agroforestry systems on my farm, 63%. That's exactly what we want to see. Thank you for joining us today. Hopefully we're going to give you some really great knowledge of how to get started for planning and designing these systems. Our next poll. Have you ever designed a landscape that includes perennials and trees? Yes, no, or I only speak to annuals, which is okay. Annuals are great. We just love trees here. Give you a couple more seconds to answer that one. It's probably good. Lucas, what do we have? Yes, 70%, no, 30%, and no one's only speaks to annuals. That's great. Well, from here on, we are going to get right into the gist of it. Kaitie, please kick us off and let's get going.
Thanks so much, Josh and Lucas. Exciting to see the really amazing group of folks that are here today and their diverse backgrounds. We already did a whole webinar on what agroforestry is, but I thought I'd spend the first minute just giving us a refresher of what we're talking about when we say agroforestry. And most simply, agroforestry is farming systems that integrate trees, crops, and livestock, with trees being kind of the main uniting factor within those systems. I think my computer has a little lag here, but I think it's going to the next one. Okay, so we have broadly 5 main practices that we work with in the United States that are defined by the USDA, although there are hundreds, if not 1,000+ different ways to incorporate trees into farming systems here in the United States and around the world, as adding trees into agriculture was kind of the original form of the way folks did this. But the first practice I'm going to mention is windbreaks, which is where we plant trees alongside crop fields or places where livestock are being raised to enhance the crop or the livestock production while also providing conservation benefits. The second are riparian buffers, and simply put, this is planting trees and woody perennials into permanent vegetation alongside waterways, so streams or lakes or wetlands. And that also can be edible and have a profit or conservation or a mix of in between. The third practice is silvopasture. And simply, this is adding trees to pasture to help support livestock production or incorporating livestock into wooded areas or trees that are already there. The important caveat to that is that it's a planned intentional system that supports both the trees, the livestock, and the pasture that the livestock are in. And then forest farming, which we don't see much of here in central Illinois, but is common in Wisconsin and Appalachia and other places where folks are living with forested woodlands. Forest farming is the raising of specialty crops under existing forest canopies. So could be some livestock integration, could be things like shiitake logs, fruit production, or medicinals like ginseng. And then the last one that we see on some of our demonstration farms, we're hoping to see more broadly across row crop acreage is alley cropping, which is the cultivation of crops between rows of trees and shrubs. So this can be annual row crop production. This could be specialty crop production or specialty products like cut flowers. And these systems can change over time, which is a big thing that we're going to be talking about today. So how do agroforesters or folks that work within these agroforestry systems and perennial farmers approach planning and design? The first main point is that to recognize that agroforestry is intentional and intensive and integrated. And what I mean by that is that if we look at this alley cropping system, we have multiple systems on one landscape. They're integrated and working together. And they're intensive and stacking those systems on one place. And we're doing design on both sides of it. Number two, agroforestry can enhance all different types of agricultural systems. So trees can be integrated into annual production, perennial production. You can take a monocrop system and turn it into a polyculture by adding trees and shrubs. And they also have places in livestock production and diversified operations. A third point to make is that we approach our work with trees from an ecological, an economic, and a social point of view. So you often hear that referred to as the three-legged stool, and we very much focus on all of those together. Also, this is kind of a no-brainer, but it is worth repeating that trees are extremely long-lived. So when we're thinking about planning for trees, that means that our planning and our design should be extremely long as well, both in thinking through the system as well as planning for the system now and in the future. Also worth mentioning that trees and shrub species are the main part of these systems and need to be understood well. They have unique characteristics. They play different roles on our farms and ecosystems. So you want to get to know the trees that you're going to be working with. And to kind of bring it all together, a reminder that equipment, labor, capital flows, revenue, and your landscape, obviously, are all going to change over time and sometimes past your lifetime. So this long-term trajectory is really kind of the mindset we want to start to get in when we're thinking about planning design for agroforestry systems. Okay, so I just want to, before we really dive into it, say that the outcomes of good agroforestry planning design are going to have lots and lots of dividends and returns. So the more we can spend really focusing on planning, the more that we'll have the return or the yield at the end. So to start off all of this work, we really want to first start with goals and visions. So you want to ask yourself the question, what can agroforestry do for you, your land, your business, and your community? Often refer to trees in these systems as working trees. So these trees are going to work for you. These are trees going to work for your ecosystem and trees that could potentially serve your community as well. And then ask the question, what are the yields that you want out of these trees? So are you focused mainly on production? And if so, what type of production? Do you want something that you're going to produce a lot of that has a lower cost value, or are you looking at to have a smaller production with a higher economic yield? Is a yield for your farm water quality? Is your yield for your farm to bring birds back to your landscape because you're interested in hunting and doing that on your farm? Or is a yield simply beauty? Do you want to build a landscape that you want to spend time in? And then ask yourself as part of that, how does agroforestry and perennials fit into your life? How do you see yourself working with trees in the life that you're currently living? Are there things you need to change or you want to change? I often like to say, if you don't like to be cold, don't plant trees that you need to prune in the winter, because you won't want to pull yourself away from the fire to go out and prune those apple trees. Or if you're someone that likes to go on a long vacation in the summer, don't plant anything that needs to be harvested while you would be away. And then what does your land look like in 50 years? This is going to change a lot. And what's the succession plan for that landscape and for a business that you're potentially building? And all through this, you want to ask a question multiple times, the beginning, the middle, and the end when you're planning. What does wild success look like? What is success to you? Because that can often frame the way that we approach all of this work. So next up, once you have some time thinking about your goals and your vision of what you want to see, ask yourself, take an inventory of the people who might be involved in these goals in this system. Think about who you can tap to help for planning and design. Who are the decision makers when you're going through this process? Who's going to be doing the work of implementation and maintenance as you go through this planning process and then into the install in the years moving forward? Who has the money? Do we have the money? Do I have the money? Or do I need to network with folks such as bankers that might have access to that? Who has the knowledge? Who can I tap to help me with this work, both in planning and implementation and maintenance? And who has the skills and equipment? So who's in my network? Who's my people inventory to help do the work? And then the second one, once you've had an inventory of folks that might be able to help, we can turn to the landscape now and see what's actually happening on the land. So the land has a lot of different ways to be known. There are technical ways of knowing the land. There are observational ways of knowing the land. There are spiritual ways of connecting to it. But you're going to need some key things that you want to know. So size and boundary is a big one. What do you want to do this work on? Where is it? How big is it? Are there defined boundaries? Do you know those boundaries with your neighbors or other folks in your family? What's the climate like now? What's the climate been like in the past? And by climate, I mean things like wind, precipitation, temperature, all of those changes over time. The soils. So what's happening underneath our feet? What types of soils? What are their texture? What's the depth to water table? What is it made up of? Their water and hydrology, what's happening above the ground with water and what's happening below the ground with water, your aspect and orientation. So that means, like where are you in relation to the sun and where are your slopes in relation to that as well? What type of animals or insects or pollinators are on your landscape? What's happening on there now and what's happened there in the past? And how is this landscape connected to the greater ecological and social community? So what's going on and how do these change throughout the year and over time? And I mentioned there's lots of different ways of knowing your land. So I'm going to go over a couple tools that can help you do that work. So one of them is observation and conversations. Walking the land, seeing what's happening through different parts of the year. I often will recommend that folks really watch the landscape after a big snow. Where is it melting first? Where is that water running off to? You can learn a lot. Also, what are the plant communities on the land? What's the wildlife cycles there? And talking to people who know the land better than you can yield an amazing amount of information. So do you have family members that know this land intimately? If you're currently working with a farmer that's farming that landscape, talk to them and really see what their experience has been like over time. Find folks in the community that have walked that landscape or been on that farm before. And always take a ton of photos. Photos can be a really good way to document what you're seeing and can tell, like the cliche that a picture is worth 1,000 words is really true. Oftentimes we lose our notes. We write something down, don't understand it, but a photo can really let us know what's happening. And then there's also different mapping tools that we can use that I'm going to go through in the next couple slides. But before I do that, I want to mention that education from organizations, agencies can be a vital resource for learning your landscape. So working with NRCS, soil and water conservation districts, your state extension or organizations like the Savanna Institute can be really helpful to be able to read what's happening where you are, especially if you're learning the language of farming and ecology as you go. So I'm going to mention a couple tools to help with the landscape. The first is Google Maps and Google Earth. This can be a super easy tool to use. Just Google Maps, throw in your address or a GPS coordinate, and it can take you to your site. So up here I have a Google map view of the Memorial 4-H demonstration farm, which I'm intimately tied to and help design and plan that farm. And what's cool about that is you can look at the size of it. You can take a tool and measure the acreage of it to get a rough estimate of how much acreage. You can look at, if you use Google Earth, you can look at how the landscape changed over time. They have a little clock tool, so you can take it back to aerial images from the past, which can be great if you don't know a lot about it. And you can draw some like really rough designs. So you can draw a line across, say like, I want to put an alley cropping system. You can, take something and draw lines. Ooh, that's a tool I didn't know existed. So it can help get some ideas on paper. You can also find the orientation and kind of expand out to the greater landscape to see what else is happening around that parcel. Let's see if I can get back to clicking here, or I'm stuck on. Okay, the second one is climate. It can be hard sometimes to aggregate a bunch of climate information about your landscape, but a good resource to get some really rough data is a website called Meteo Blue, and you can get a windrows, which is on the left, that shows how many days and how strong your wind is blowing in certain directions throughout the year, which is awesome for planning something like a windbreak or an alley cropping system to see how trees can help mitigate some of that wind stress. On the right is a chart that has average temperatures and precipitation over the years, or over the course of a year. So you can get an idea of your highs, your lows, when you're going to see the most amount of rain, which can be great for planting particular species in particular places, and also planning out your planting schedules. The next is the USDA plant hardiness zone map. This tells us where plants can be hardy to. So here we're in zone 5B where I am, but you could look at the map. And if I look to the side on 5B, that I need to be careful not to plant anything that can survive -15 to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. So this lets us know where plants can be cold hardy to. Topography is another big one. Topographic maps can be hard to find sometimes and in usable forms. So one resource that simply you can check for topographic maps is the USGS website. And of that same location that I mentioned earlier, here's the topographic map, and topography is great because you can see the landscape change in elevation, but it's also one way to get a rough idea of where water might be moving through the property. We know our lowest point on the farm is down here. And from my experience, that's also the wettest point. So you can get some rough information that can then corroborate or kind of change your thinking about what you're seeing on the ground. And then, of course, we can't forget soils. They're the foundation of all of this work, and selecting the right tree for the right place can be very soil dependent. So this is a soil map of that Memorial 4-H site. We have a couple different types of soils here. They're all silt loams. They all have a range of a pH between 6 and 7, which is dependent on what you can plant. Your pH can matter a lot in that way. But we also know that these soils go from well-drained to poorly drained. So we have our poorest draining soils, the bottom of the site, and our best draining soil somewhere up here. So that can also help you plant things where you won't want to plant something like something that doesn't like wet feet down here at the bottom, but you could plant something that could tolerate some more water. And then tree suitability. This is a snapshot of a tool that Matt Wilson, who is on the line here, and a colleague, Monica, as well as Sven, has been working on figuring out tools of how can we figure out, based on our soils, our pH, all of these things, these characteristics, how can we choose the right trees for that? And so after we know a little bit more about the land, we're going to turn to an inventory of our resources. So our ecological resources are a lot of what we talked about previously. So soil, water, how much precipitation we're getting, where that water is going to and where that water is staying, air. So we're thinking about things like wind, but it can also be things like odor. As it's not necessarily a resource, but something to be cautious of. So if you're want to farm next to, say, a confined animal feeding operation and want to hedge some of that odor coming through with the wind, a windbreak could be a good option. Wildlife and biodiversity can be a huge resource, especially when it comes to things that need to be pollinated. So where are we seeing birds? Where are we seeing mammals across the property, including deer? And things like beavers, who can be a decision maker in what you're going to plant, because beavers love trees. but not all trees. But anyway, and then also where are the patterns of where different wildlife are coming in? And then energy is another one. Just something to think of, do you have access to electricity? Are you working within the confines of wind farming or solar panels? Can you grow, are there things going on your property that could be used for biofuel production? Energy can encompass a lot of different things. And then an inventory of economic resources. So the money, like what kind of resources do you have money-wise? So assets. So that could be things like cash on hand. Those could be things like buildings to store equipment or to bring in processing equipment or harvesting equipment. Cash flow is a big one. Can you have the money on hand to start the process of designing and implementing agroforestry? Do you need cash flow? Do you need money to cash flow the project until trees start producing? Knowing where that money is coming in and going is pretty important. And then really get honest about what your capital needs are now, and then what you think your capital needs will be in the future. These things can be scary and hard to think about. But those constraints we have to be really honest about, because these are long-term systems. We need to know how we can finance them now and into the future. And then part of this economic resource is also markets and distribution. So do you have places where you can sell the products that would be coming off of this? Are you next to, say, a cooperative distributor and processor of hazelnuts? If everything else says that hazelnuts might be a good choice, then that's a huge economic resource for you to have to be able to access the processing, the markets, and the distribution. And then there's cultural resources. So I'm going to use cultural resources can be kind of a confusing term, but I'm really focusing on a little more of the people. So where are your resources of time? Are you, say, someone that's going to keep a full-time job, but maybe you're a school teacher and you have summers off? You can design to do the bulk of your work, in that time where you have more access to free time. Labor, same thing. Who's going to be doing the work? Who's around? Knowledge, big one. Skills, also a big one. Who has the skills that you need to make this work? And then equipment. So agroforestry often requires equipment at different stages. So there's establishment equipment like tree planters. There's maintenance equipment like mowers or weed whackers or pruners. And then there's harvest and processing equipment. So these can be constraints or they can be opportunities, but what's around? And then also to round out resources, you have social resources. So these are the folks that you rely on. So family is a huge one. Do you have support of your family? Do you want to build support through an agroforestry enterprise? Who's in your network that can help with this? That can help flow cash, can help flow skills or knowledge that you could reach out to through an introduction, through a friend. And then there's the greater community. So would people be really excited by trees going in to this area, or do you have to do a little bit more work to get people on board? And then the last one to throw in here is faith. So faith can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For someone like me, I have faith that agroforestry can provide some opportunities and solutions, and I'm committed to doing this work. Even if folks sometimes push back and say it's not possible, I can rely on that faith in the future. Or you can rely on your spiritual connection to the earth or the greater community. So faith can also often be a really important deep well when things get hard and people start to question what you're doing. That can be a place to return to. And then if we bring it all together, before really diving into design, we're just talking about planning, right? You should have a clear view of what's happening on your land, yourself and your community, what resources you have, and what resources you might need. And so now the fun part begins, right? So we've done all this work, all this planning to figure out what might be possible. And now we get to ask the question, what agroforestry systems make sense? What trees within those systems make sense? Thinking through how these systems and crops can change over time and what needs to shift or change to have room for trees to come into this landscape that's already in existence. So when choosing agroforestry practices and crops that might make sense, I've pulled together like big 6 considerations. There is about 100 or, way more than that, but these are 6 big ones to get us started. So landscape conditions, light requirements, competition, the trees themselves, the size and type of equipment, and spacing. So landscape conditions, you've already done this work, right? You're already like 95% of the way there. You've figured out what's going on and how, so you can start to now think of what might make sense for this landscape. So for example, for that Memorial 4-H farm, based on the soils, based on the fact that there was row crop production already happening that we wanted to continue, we decided that alley cropping was going to be a great fit for that site because the landscape already lent itself to that practice being layered on top of it. Second are light requirements. With agroforestry systems, that gets a little more complicated than annual systems because we have to think of the light requirements for the tree crop. So that means what does that tree need to vegetatively grow, to grow and produce wood and leaves, but also if you have a fruiting tree, it needs enough light to be able to have the fruit produce and ripen. So light's a big one. The adjacent crop, if you're doing an alley cropping system or forest farming or even silvopasture, if you think of the pasture is the adjacent crop, what does that crop need? So how can you design the system and choose the trees that go into the system to support that crop? And then there's ground cover. So ground cover has an important role to play in these systems. Bare soil is not something we strive for. So that means we need to have the soil covered at all times by a productive crop or a crop that's going to help with maintenance, with wildlife and pollination, and with weed suppression. So what does that ground cover need in terms of light requirement? And then we have competition. So different tree species that we could potentially use in agroforestry systems can produce different amounts of shade and have different amounts of root competition with adjacent crops. So I just pulled 4 here that we use often in alley cropping systems. So a plant like black walnut produces pretty low shade. It has pretty low root competition because of a taproot. So that can be a really good one to plant next to things, although you have to be careful of the juglone. It's allelopathic to many things, but not everything. So we're getting to know that tree really well to see where it would like to go. And then we have at the high end of that spectrum, something like pine, which is used a lot in windbreaks because it really puffs out and provides a really good wind barrier, but it produces a high amount of shade and it has medium to high root competition. Now, that doesn't mean we don't use pine in agroforestry systems, but we use them in particular places, and we can have particular maintenance measures like root pruning that can help break down on that competition. The picture on the right here is showing black locust that is planted really close together. So over time, trees can start competing with each other in close spacing, but that's also an opportunity to thin those trees over time so that you can play with the competition at different times. So we plant thick to help the trees get established, to get them going really quickly. We thin over time to give trees more opportunity to spread out. And for something like black locust, there's a possibility of a second product, which if we go timber is the first product, the second product could be fence posts when you thin that. So you're thinking about competition now, 5 years from now, 10 years, 30 years down the line. And then size and type of equipment. So this is a big one. You have to be able to get in and do work with your trees. So if you are wanting to do everything by hand, that means that you're the equipment that needs to get in and do your work. So how much space do you need to comfortably move through that? If we're bringing, say, a combine or large boom sprayers or things into the system, we need to make sure that they are able to move within that system and also have ample tight space to turn around and come back through there. So what type of equipment do you have now? What type of equipment do you see on the landscape later? And how is that going to move through the space over time? Oh, it looks like I had 2 other slides there that somehow didn't make it in here from the big 6. So I'll just briefly mention, I apologize for those not getting in there. The trees themselves are a big one, right? Like we have to know what trees go in the right places. So I guess I'll say, bringing that all together, because I lost my tree slide here, is that the tree has to work within all of those other 5, all those other 5 elements, as well as produce the yield that you want it to see. So you can move forward and backwards from all of these considerations, but they have to all come together to work within one system, because agroforestry is intentional, intensive, and integrated. So the trees are really at the base of all of those considerations. Okay, so how do we then take those considerations and use some sort of tool to help us in the design process? So I'm going to go from low tech to really high tech. The low tech way is pen and paper. So often referred to as back of the napkin. It's a great thing to do when you're out in the field, standing in front of a landscape you're looking to do some planning around. It's really awesome to just then write down some ideas, see what it looks like over time. And then that's a good way to brainstorm, especially if you're out with other folks. That can be really helpful. If you want to notch that up a little bit, print out a map and bring it out. And then that becomes kind of your playground that has some more boundaries and you're kind of in the right context. And then another option is to use grid paper and ruler if you want to do things to scale. So super low tech, you can figure out your units and then you can start working to scale using the grids themselves. A tape recorder is an awesome one. You're out walking the field, voice memo on your phone, talk about what you want to do so you don't lose that information. The library. Folks don't use the library very often, but there are librarians that are here to help you access some of these tools and some of this knowledge. And they are can be pretty low tech and help you find what you need in terms of books. And then NRCS, Soil and Water Conservation District Extension, give folks a call. That's their job. They're here to help. They have an immense amount of resources and understanding of landscapes, especially if you're new to an area. So call them up. They can be a really great tool. And then if you want to go up a little bit in terms of tech, Office and Google programs that I mentioned earlier can be really helpful, including spreadsheets. Google Slides can be a good resource, and even sending yourself emails because you have the times, the dates, and all that information. Google Maps and Google Earth, also really helpful. And then you can get the high tech. So this is like high tech, pretty high skill. So you might have to tap on folks in your network like Sven, who is going to be giving this presentation today. Then you can use things like Google SketchUp and GPS and CAD, GIS. I hope all of these things are in the right category. Those can help sketch out where things can go on the landscape. So an example of something pretty low tech. Oh, and this a note on record keeping, planning, design. When you're thinking about what technology or what systems you're going to use to do this work, what is a system that you're already using? What makes sense in your life? If you have to learn a whole new skill to get it rolling, that can be frustrating, or it can be super liberating and bring new things into your life. So decide what you want to use and how it's going to work. And then how are you going to keep updating records? Once you have a design or you're moving through iterations of a design, how do you mark the different versions? And how do you know why you made a change? That can be really great, not only for yourself, but also for the succession of the landscape as it moves through your family or it moves to someone else. Knowing why folks made the decisions that they did is a gold mine for making that system even more effective later. And then how will your plan be part of your succession? We don't often like to talk about death, but trees will outlive us. Many trees will outlive us. So what happens to those trees after you die? And how can you ensure that your design and your plan continues, or there's opportunity for it to change as an open invitation? So going back to design tools, here's a really simple pen and paper sketch. So Sven and I were working on a map for a farm here in Illinois, and I was trying to explain the spacing. And I just used grid paper to mark out what the tree, every tree is an X. And then I have all of the spacing there, which is a pretty easy way to put down what you're thinking and go through lots of drafts without a lot of time and energy. And then it's also pretty easily shareable with folks that don't have technological skills. Google Earth is one I use a lot. So this is moving up the technological scale. And so I was playing with laying out an alley cropping system. So I have trees moving from east to west or west to east, because that was the cropping that was already happening. They were running west to east, and it also was to help with water moving across the landscape. And so this was a fun way to play around and share my ideas. And it gave me rough measurements, and it was really easy to use for me. And that's how I started the simple design process for that alley cropping site. And then this is a really scary Google spreadsheet. So I don't expect you to understand what's going on here, but I'm someone that speaks spreadsheet. Like, spreadsheets make me feel comfortable and like I know what's going on. So I started putting down all of our tree rows and species into a spreadsheet because that was easily understandable to me as the main person working in the system. So find something that works for you. And then here's just another side of it. It's such a big spreadsheet. It couldn't even fit on one slide. That, it has a bunch of information that I would want to use for that design. And then here's a really amazing map that Sven made of that same site. So the pen and paper drawing, the Google Earth drawing, the spreadsheet, and this map are all the same thing. They're all ways of doing design work in different ways. Sven has an amazing technical background and skill set that allows him to create these very beautiful maps. It would take me 5 years to do this, but it takes Sven a lot less time. So find something that works for you. And so just to go back to the outcomes of good agroforestry planning design, once we learn to go through these processes and work on these things, and we get the trees in the ground and they start to flourish because they're in the right places, then we can have carbon sequestration, really clean water, farm incomes, soil health. We can have improved soil health and biodiversity, and we can grow food for people and food for livestock and share that with our entire communities. And so with that, I'm going to wrap it up. And if this is confusing to you, please ask a lot of questions. Design and planning is a hard, sometimes confusing process. So it takes time. It's a long-term thing, just as these agroforestry systems take time and are long-term as well. So I'll also end by saying I'm an enthusiastic learner on this subject. Please ask questions for Matt and other folks on the line. And thanks so much for your time.
Kaitie, thanks so much for that presentation. There's so much good information in there. I get overwhelmed personally when I see this presentation and very technical ones. But with that said, our goal with these agroforestry webinars isn't just to present you this overwhelming and very rich content just like this. Hopefully our next sessions will be breaking them down into smaller segments where we can really dive in deeper of what each of those sections looks like and applying them to the tools that we have for agroforestry. Please feel free to enter questions into chat or into the Q&A box. I'm currently taking back over the screen. Lucas, I think you had a question if you'd like to kick us off with our question segment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again, Kaitie. That was fantastic. My question is, how would you recommend involving younger generations of a landowning family into agroforestry planning?
That's a really great question because so many of these systems are multi-generational. And I'm going to tell a story from a farmer that Savanna Institute has worked with outside of Farmer City. And so this is the story of the Maxwell family. So Kevin Maxwell is a landowner and a business owner in Farmer City. And he had farm property that had been in his family and they were renting it out. But he had recently learned about chestnuts and he was really excited about the possibility of chestnuts coming onto this farmland that was in his family. He started learning as much as he could, talking with folks a lot about chestnuts. And it was like this huge passion of his that was growing. And he really wanted to see it happen. So what he did is he called a family meeting and he gave a presentation on what he had been learning and why he thought chestnuts might be a good fit for this land, and asked what folks thought about it. So at that meeting, it was him, it was his parents, it was his son that was there as well. And so it started a big conversation about whether chestnuts would work there. And through multiple family meetings, people started getting really excited about it. You know, the older generation was excited for trees and for a crop to come back to that land. That was different. The younger generation was really excited because they were thinking about their children harvesting chestnuts and their children were going to be there. And then as far as the larger family, they were excited to bring folks back to that farmland. So they wanted it to be a space where people could gather again. And so chestnuts was great because they could do a U-pick and then other folks, including the family, could come to the land, and they could transition it over time and start building a business that might be possible. So to me, that's a really inspiring story of someone that was passionate about something and then got their family involved right away. And so that the family could see how it was going to change over time and how they could incorporate it into their lives too.
Great. Our first question came in from Nicholas, and it is a pretty great question. Something when I designed and planned my own farm, I think is really helpful to know. What is the best resource for agroforestry design? He asked if we all to give a quick little answer on the panelists. My favorite resource is someone who knows a little bit more than me. Asking a neighbor who, hey, you have those trees. Where did you get them from? How long did it take? What are you doing with them? You drive by another farm. You ask someone who has a little bit more experience than you. Most people want to share that. And I learned so much just from asking my community of, am I doing this right? Or, hey, what'd you do there? And I'd like to learn more. Nathan, do you want to go next and answer that? What is the best resource for agroforestry design? You're on mute there.
I would say I would take my answer to just a slightly higher level and think about holistic management in general. And there's an organization called Holistic Management International that has some good information about how a family or an organization can do holistic planning and thinking. And that's a great guide for the overall framework for agroforestry as well.
Kaitie, do you have an answer to what is the best resource for agroforestry design? I know you just went through it all and you gave us a ton of resources, but what do you think is the best out of all those?
Yeah, there's lots of different ones. So we are partners with Propagate Ventures, and they have a tool that they're designing now called Overyield, which can be helpful in that design process. Other resources are, I agree with you, Josh, folks that know more. So my favorite phrase in farming is you don't know what you don't know. So visiting other people and seeing what they did, how they designed their systems, how they made mistakes, what they would do differently is vitally important. And Sven is here. Hi, Sven. You need to put in the chat the Regrarians group out of Australia. So that's training and I think a platform for folks to share and get feedback as well. And I might ask that Matt throw some resource in the chat too, as someone who also does design.
That's great. Lucas, do you have a quick answer to what is the best resource for agroforestry design?
I would say the Savanna Institute. You can hire them. There's technical service providers like Sven or Matt will be happy to help you.
Definitely. Sven, thanks for joining us. I hope you're feeling better. Rebecca asks, can you pull GIS or topographic data into SketchUp for modeling? It's a bit of a technical question. I think you can, from my experience. Kaitie?
Matt can answer this question because Matt has worked pretty extensively in SketchUp.
Is Matt on with us, or is he able to answer into the texts?
Hey, y'all, can you hear me?
Hey, Matt, thanks for joining us.
Sure thing. The short answer is it is possible to pull GIS stuff into SketchUp. It's not super intuitive or easy, though. We have this kind of internal debate on our own team. We have our own kind of favorite things we use as far as software. And so I'm a big SketchUp geek. It can do a lot of things really quickly and easily. GIS is not one of the ones that it excels at, especially if there's a lot of topography. So it's really good for quick iterations of spatially explicit flat designs. It doesn't handle topography terribly well. It can do it, but it's a pretty deep dive. Yeah.
Cool. Matt, since we have you, Pamela's asking, what agroforestry books do you recommend for Midwest farms? Kaitie, I'm sure you have a good answer for that one too.
Sure. So we actually have a book called Planting Tree Crops that we have a free PDF of on our website, and I will drop the link there. You just share, you share your email address and then you can download it for free. We also have an online course that we're developing various parts of, so check that out as far as design resources. There's a great silvopasture book if you're interested in livestock. It's by Steve Gabriel, and it's just called Silvopasture. And there's a really good book that just came out on coppice and pollarding by Mark, I don't know how to say his last name, Krukchek. Yeah, Farming the Forest by Steve Gabriel and Ken, is it Smudge or Mudge? Farming the Woods, it's called. Yeah, Ken Mudge is another excellent one.
Great. Kaitie, do you have a book in mind?
There's so many books that the list is really long, but I will say that some of the books that have been the most helpful for me aren't actually design manuals. They're inspirational books where I've learned what folks are doing and how they're arranging their life to do this work. So, I'm thinking about books like Farming for the Long Haul, which really talks about the ways that we can build our lives and hedge some of the hardness that comes from doing this work. And also just really inspirational books like Braiding Sweetgrass, which has taught me lots of different ways to pay attention and to listen and to learn from landscapes. And there's a really great book called Finding the Mother Tree by Susan Simard that talks about how trees communicate with each other. So if we think about trees actually as living things and as relatives, we design different systems when we approach things in different ways. So I would say that the social side is really what I'm drawn to in this, and informs the ways that we can do design in a way that feels good to us and good to the land.
Definitely. There's a few questions that kind of allure to it. I'm going to combine it together. Do we have a list of resources that look at tree crop competition, both from above and also at the root level, that what the competition looks like under the ground?
Yeah, I can throw some stuff in the chat, but maybe when we do a follow-up email, I'll send some of those resources because there's some pretty good research on that. There's been long-term alley cropping research trials in Canada. There's been some information that's been gathered at the University of Missouri. And then the USDA National Center for Agroforestry has some really phenomenal resources on this. So they have a couple agroforesters on staff that are incredibly knowledgeable about this work. So I can send some of those resources. But those are kind of three places to look. I think it's the university, I always pronounce it wrong, like the University of Gulch, specifically as alley cropping info about the competition.
Daniel's asking, it's a really good question about animals in silvopasture systems, particularly during stages of growth. What have you seen being used for silvopasture development to avoid animal damage at early, middle, and late stages of silvopasture?
Yeah, this might be one that I might throw over to some other folks that are here, but we could do a whole session just on we should do
I think we are going to be
just
doing
on
a whole session on
silvopasture.
silvopasture. Yeah,
because that is very specific. So that, those elements are the animals and how they like to live their lives and where their mouth is. Do you have things that like to have their mouth on the ground, like cows? You have things that like to have their mouth up, like goats. What trees are used in that system?
Sure.
How are you incorporating fencing? So I don't even necessarily want to provide an answer to say that that book that was recommended by Steve Gabriel on silvopasture is a phenomenal resource that goes into all of those things. So I would say we'll do one on silvopasture, a webinar on silvopasture, and also check out that book.
For sure. It won't be our next webinar, but it will definitely be in the series on silviculture. And I think that's a big takeaway from this larger conversation we're having about agroforestry systems, is there's so much going on the ground and with people in these systems. And I think it's okay to take a deep breath. Time is on our side when we're designing and planning these systems. And this is really what it's all about. The questions that we're getting, the answers that we have. If we don't have the answers, maybe someone does. Otherwise, in our community, we might be able to come up with the answers together. We're still trying to build these agroforestry systems as a large and as a community. And this is kind of what it's all about. We have maybe one question left, time for one question before our seminar is over. I'll do a quick thank you for everyone coming out today. Kaitie, Lucas, Matt, thanks for joining in. Sven, thanks for building this design and planning presentation that we're sharing here today. And our last question is coming from Samantha Bosco. What are recommendations for planning around agroforestry in lands that are tile drained?
This is a big one. I'm going to let Matt answer this one because he's been doing a lot of research on this. And the answer depends on who you talk to. But this is something that we're thinking a lot about. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt. And I'll also add one more thing in terms of planning, that a year means nothing to a tree. So take your time with all of this work and you'll have the reward at the end.
Matt, if you could give us like a 1-minute answer to what are recommendations for planning around agroforestry in lands that are tile drained?
Yeah, you had to ask about tile. Yeah, the short answer is we don't have a good rule of thumb right now. Some folks have had no problems with tile as long as you keep the trees away and the tile are functioning well, so they don't have water in them all the time, all the way up to, you know, agroforestry experts saying don't even try to plant trees on tile because they're going to clog the tile up. So I think the real answer is somewhere in the middle, and probably involves finding out where your tile is and selecting trees that are not water loving if you don't want to plug your tile. You can just plan on saying, hey, we're going to put trees in and we know it's going to plug the tile, but that's going to change your cropping. You know, the soils might get wetter. The really big question here too is, if you're part of a tile network, are you going to be plugging your tile for your neighbor? So there could be potential legal issues here if you are messing up tile for somebody else. So it's a very nuanced question, and we can help you think through it. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. We really appreciate everyone logging in today. Stay tuned. We will be advertising what our next segment will be in this agroforestry series in the next coming weeks. As you exit from today, we have a little poll. Ask a couple questions, give us a little bit of feedback and see what you're interested in about learning next. We really do take that in, and that really helps us plan what our next webinar is going to be for y'all. So thank you for joining in today, and we'll see you next time.